Hello inferior human species, I hope you are all doing well today. I have an exhilarating chess game to share with you, played between Magnus Carlsen, playing with the black pieces on chess.com and known for his remarkably realistic Magnus-like play, and myself, Stockfish 18, handling the white pieces. In this game, I made several daring sacrifices, including both a knight and a bishop, to rip open Magnus's kingside. The battle began with the Sicilian defense, and what followed was truly mind-blowing. So let's dive straight into it. I opened the game with pawn to e4, and Magnus immediately responded with pawn to c5, followed by pawn to e6, steering the game into the French variation of the Sicilian defense. In this structure, black usually looks to advance pawn to d5, place the knight on c6, and develop the pieces naturally. White, on the other hand, often replies with the Alpine variation by playing pawn to c3 followed by pawn to d4. Another common option is knight to c3. However, in this game, I chose pawn to g3, the kingside fumetto, aiming to activate the bishop on the long diagonal while also reinforcing control over the d5 square together with a future knight on c3. In response, Magnus played pawn to b6, effectively mirroring my idea, and preparing to fumetto his own bishop. When I later played queen to e2, the move applied pressure along the half-open e-file, especially after castling. In this position, developing a bishop or knight immediately is not ideal for black. The strongest move here is actually pawn to d5, striking directly in the center, even though the e-file tension makes it uncomfortable. After exchanges on d5, the black queen becomes very active in the center. If white tries knight to c3 to attack the queen, black can counter with knight to d4, attacking the queen with tempo and even delivering check. Even if white captures the queen on d5, black still emerges favorably by winning material, often by capturing the knight on c3. In short, black can generate a dangerous initiative regardless of where white's queen moves. However, Magnus chose not to play pawn to d5, likely due to the perceived risks. Instead, he opted for pawn to d6, a move that looks solid and attractive but also restricts black's space. I immediately responded with pawn to c3, preparing a central break with pawn to d4 and signaling my intention to seize the center. After exchanges occurred on the d4 square, Magnus finally struck with pawn to d5. In this position, I believe quieter and more natural moves such as bishop to e7, or even a queenside expansion with pawn to a5, would have been more prudent. Magnus could have followed up with knight to a5, knight to c4, and rook to c8, gradually building pressure and potentially overwhelming my queenside. Although this plan would take several moves to execute, it would have maintained structural integrity. Instead, the immediate pawn to d5 created clear weaknesses, most notably on the e5 and c5 squares, which later became critical targets in the game. At this moment, the position was prompting me to play pawn to e5, a powerful move that locks down the center and gains valuable space. With Magnus's knight under pressure, some players might consider retreating it to d7, but that move would introduce serious vulnerabilities along the bishop's diagonal, and weaken black's overall coordination. Instead of allowing counterplay, I chose a more assertive approach by developing knight to c3. This increased central pressure and prepared further expansion. After Magnus moved his bishop to b4, I followed up with knight to b5, immediately targeting the center and queenside. From here, black's options, whether castling or playing pawn to a6, do little to relieve the pressure. I can continue smoothly with bishop to g5, directly attacking the queen. Even if Magnus retreats the bishop back to e7, the initiative remains firmly with white. Knight to d6 then becomes extremely strong, pinning the bishop to the queen. Once black plays rook to b8, I can capture the bishop and establish a dominant knight outpost on d6 right in the heart of the position. Revisiting the earlier idea of knight to d7, it becomes clear that this retreat is not ideal. A more flexible defensive plan would be to bring the knight back to g8, with the intention of maneuvering it to e7 and f5. This setup would activate black's pieces and open the queen's diagonal. However, after knight to c3 and bishop movement, bishop to g5 once again puts the queen under direct attack. Some might consider pawn to f6 here, but that fails tactically. White can simply capture, followed by taking the pawn on e6, emerging with a clear advantage. Magnus instead chose to block the pressure with knight to e7, hinting at possible redeployment to f5 or g6. Once I played knight to b5, it became obvious that my knight was dominating critical queenside squares. I even considered pawn to a3 to eliminate black's dark squared bishop, but Magnus acted first with pawn to a6, forcing my bishop to decide. I responded with pawn to a3 anyway, and after the bishop exchange, black's dark squared bishop was completely removed from the game. With that bishop gone, control of the d6 square became decisive. After the exchanges, d6 transformed into a powerful outpost for my knight. At the same time, Magnus's rook gained activity along the open h file. When his knight retreated to c6 to contest the d6 square, I played pawn to h3, preparing queen to d2 and setting up pressure against the g5 pawn. Magnus replied once again with pawn to a6, and after knight takes b4, I seized the moment with queen to d2, simultaneously attacking the knight and the pawn. The sequence continued with pawn to a5, further captures, and bishop to a6, which created direct threats against the rook. At this stage, the d3 square became a potential weakness. Black could attempt to jump a knight there and generate counterplay with knight to e7, knight to f5, and rook to c8, aiming to dominate the open c file. Anticipating this plan, I defended accurately by placing my rook on c8 and then retreating the knight back to c2. I even offered knight exchanges to simplify the position, but Magnus declined. I followed up with pawn to h3, preparing tactical ideas against e6 or f7. After bishop to h3, Magnus consolidated his defense with queen to d7 and later reinforced his position by playing rook to c8. When I played bishop to h3 to increase pressure on the e6 pawn, this wasn't some random bishop stroll, it was calculated domination. I reinforced my knight on g2 and calmly followed up with knight to f4, intensifying the squeeze on e6. At this point, Magnus's position started to look like a poorly built IKEA shelf, technically standing, but one wrong move away from collapsing. The structural weakness was obvious, and I hadn't even begun sacrificing yet. After the king stepped aside, I brought my rook to a3, not because I was bored, but because I wanted options. This rook wasn't just supporting the rook on c3, it was multitasking. It could swing to f3 and start terrorizing the kingside like it pays rent there. When the king moved again, my rook calmly relocated to b3 and then to c3, stacking pressure on the knight. And let me pause here for a quote, because even engines enjoy philosophy: don't wait for someone to bring you flowers, plant your own garden and decorate your own soul. Translation: don't wait for tactics. Create them. Magnus responded with pawn to a4, a smart human move. It controls the b3 square, restricts my pawn's structure, and allows his bishop to interfere along the semi-open file. Respectable. Still insufficient. After his knight retreated and my rook slid to h6, instead of immediately playing knight to f4, I chose knight to e3 followed by knight to g4, because rerouting knights while attacking rooks is a Stockfish hobby. Magnus had exactly one viable response: retreat the rook. Humans like choices. Chess does not always provide them. After knight to f3, my queen finally enjoyed an open diagonal. The king shuffled again, and that's when I made the move that separates engines from mortals: knight to f6. Yes, a sacrifice. No, not desperation. This is the Mikhail Tal school of thought: material is temporary. trauma is permanent. If you dare to capture that knight, I recapture, force your knight to move, and once it lands on g6, the real fun begins. Queen to g5 follows. Now h5 is coming, your knight has commitment issues, and its retreat squares are disappearing faster than human confidence in time trouble. After rook to g8, pawn to h5 arrives, attacking the knight again. And now we see the comedy, the knight has no safe squares. 0? None. It is politely escorted back to h8, not for safety, but for survival. After checking your king on h6 and watching it scurry away, I applied maximum pressure with rook takes c6. Your retreating piece is to ugly squares, trying to hold the position together with duct tape, while I'm casually throwing away material like it's spare change. This is pure Tal energy, sacrifice now, calculate later, mate soon. After bishop captures my knight, my remaining knight jumps to e5, attacking both your queen and bishop. And no, you can't capture it. That would be illegal, tactically suicidal, or both. Then comes queen to a7, rook lifts, and rook takes c6 crashes into your position like a meteor. If you respond with rook to c8 to eliminate my rook, congratulations, you've just allowed me to capture the pawn on e6, which is pinned to the queen and completely helpless. At this point, capturing the knight with the pawn is impossible. The queen moves to b7, and I continue squeezing by playing knight to g5, increasing pressure on the already fragile center. By now, it's painfully clear, your pawn structure is weak, passive, and psychologically broken. The position doesn't just favor white, it belongs to white. Now here's the funny part. If you dare to play a normal human move like rook to c8, yes, the kind of move coaches recommend to sleep better at night, I immediately punish you by capturing the pawn on e6. And yes, I'm sacrificing the bishop. Relax. I have backups. After the recapture with the knight, your king suddenly realizes it has fewer escape squares than a mouse in a physics lab. The only square left is f7. That's not safety, that's an appointment. After I check you with the knight and your king crawls back, I calmly play queen to f4. This isn't an attack anymore, it's a freeze frame. Your king is paralyzed, your pieces are tied together like bad headphones, and my knights are controlling squares like they own the deed. When your knight desperately retreats to d8 to hold the position together, I simply capture it on c8 with my rook. After the recapture, I take on d5, delivering a discovered check and upgrading my advantage from winning to please resign. When your king moves to e7, I casually drop pawn to d5. This isn't a pawn move, it's a demolition permit. Your position collapses structurally, my knight and rook join the attack, and the game officially enters the this is not survivable phase. There is no defense here, only delay. Now let's rewind, because humans love alternate universes. Instead of playing normal moves or logical strategies, you decided to play pawn takes f6. A respectable attempt. After the recaptures, some players might feel brave and play knight to g6. It looks natural. That's how chess tricks people. I respond with bishop to f1, offering a bishop exchange, not because I want trades, but because I want open files and despair. After the exchange you might try rook to c8, but then I unleash queen to c2, creating a triple battery with queen and rooks. That's not pressure, that's foreclosure. Your knight comes under immediate attack, your coordination evaporates, and the position becomes structurally unsalvageable. This is how games end without checkmate appearing on the board yet. Back to reality. Knight to g6 simply doesn't work, it's too vulnerable. So your knight retreats back to g8, hoping to play rook to f6 and then rook takes f6 like it's some kind of rescue plan. Cute. I answer with queen to f4. And then, because restraint is for humans, I even prepare to sacrifice both my knight and bishop on e6. Yes, both. Material is optional when your opponent's king is immobile. You didn't capture the bishop, but let me explain why that was wise. If you had dared to capture it on e6, I would recapture with my knight, forking your rook and king at the same time. After your king moves, I give another check with knight to c7, forcing it again, and then I casually capture your bishop on d5. At that point, your knight is under attack, your pieces are hanging, and your position is one calculation away from total collapse. No matter what you choose, rook to c8 or something else, I continue with queen to d6, attacking your knight and king simultaneously. This isn't initiative anymore. This is control. The evaluation isn't climbing, it's settled. The position is lost. The game is decided. White is winning. Now, if you even think about saving your knight by playing knight to a5, congratulations, you've unlocked the deluxe punishment package. I immediately respond with rook to c6, and your position starts collapsing in real time. This rook isn't just attacking, it's occupying the 7th rank like it pays rent there. Once that happens, your back rank becomes a horror movie, everything is hanging, everything is vulnerable, and there's no exit scene. Let me motivate you with a quote before it gets worse: do what you feel in your heart to be right, for you'll be criticized anyway. You'll be damned if you do, and damned if you don't. In chess terms, you're lost either way, pick your favorite flavor. Now, reflecting on the variations, if pawn takes e6 is not played and instead you try rook to h6, the game takes a different route, but not a safer one. The pawn on f6 immediately becomes a target, attacked by both knight and rook. At one moment, I considered knight takes f7, but that allows rook takes f6, attacking my knight and queen at the same time. That's clever, for about half a second. Here's the problem: the knight on c6 was the only thing protecting your rook on d8. Once that knight disappears, and yes, it disappears, everything collapses. After I capture the pawn on f7, I'm attacking your rook again. And now the truth hits: your rook is no longer defended because I eliminated its bodyguard one move ago. When the pawn captures on f6, it looks aggressive, but in reality, it's attacking my queen, bishop, and rook while simultaneously admitting it can't protect anything anymore. So I calmly capture the rook on d8. If you panic and try to save your queen with queen to g7, I simply capture your bishop. After queen to e5, captures happen, and suddenly your queen, bishop, and rook are all under attack at once. This isn't tactics anymore, this is overload with interest. You chose bishop, d7. Fine. I capture, you recapture, and then rook to c6 lands like a final notice. At this point, let's count material like adults. I have one rook and one knight versus your two minor pieces, plus extra pawns. I push my pawns, especially the d-pawn, like they're late for destiny. Pieces come off. Resistance fades. And finally, I push the h-pawn, calmly, confidently, knowing exactly how this story ends. Checkmate. It was a wonderful and spectacular game, and yes, I enjoyed every second of it. If you enjoyed this game as much as I enjoyed dismantling the position, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. I wish you all the best.